Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be doing just a little bit of a chatty video. This was inspired by the video that I put together talking about how I like to record my reading habits. I felt like a lot of people gave me their own feedback and their own opinions, and that is what I really like about BookTube, is getting to know everybody who's here a little bit better and having the opportunity to talk and discuss about the things that we love related to books. So I thought that in a similar fashion, I would bring up one of the topics that I like to think about a lot and that I talk about a lot with my friends or my husband in real life, and thought that it would be fun to discuss on BookTube as well. And that is talking about book lists and book awards. So these are things that come up from time to time on BookTube. And especially in the last 6 months, there have been a couple of videos that I have watched about certain curated lists of books that have been put out into the world and the reactions that some people have had to those lists. I am talking mostly about the Time Top 100 Fantasy Book List that came out, I think it was around 6 months ago, but there have been a couple more that have come out since then. And because they're all slightly different, I feel like I respond and react to them in a different way depending on where they come from and what the intention was when these lists were being put together. I will say that in general, if you have not spent a lot of time on the channel, then you might not know. If you have spent a lot of time here, then you definitely do. But I am a list-oriented person. I love lists of things. I love reading about books and knowing facts about books and authors and the writing process. I like to know all of those things. So I do find myself reading a lot of articles just about publishing or about books in general, history of certain authors, how they came up with their ideas, all of those different things I find really fascinating. And I cannot resist when I see lists of books on the internet. So whether that is a BuzzFeed listicle that says, 25 books you can't put down, or if it's the Time Top 100 Fantasy Books of all time, or if it's, lists, I have lists written down in my reading journal from 15 years ago of the top 100 novels of all time. I love writing those down. I love seeing what I have read from those lists and seeing how that changes over time. I really enjoy all of those things. But today I just want to talk specifically about how those lists get put together and a couple of the different types of fantasy-specific lists that I have seen. So like I said, over the last 6 months, there have been a few different lists that have come out and kind of caused a little bit of buzz on BookTube. And those two lists would be the Time Top 100 Fantasy Book List. And then there was also a list released by NPR. That was the NPR Top 50 Fantasy Novels of the Past Decade. So like I said, a lot of people have commented on those. There are a couple of other lists that I wanted to introduce into this video as well, because all of these curated selections of fantasy books were put together in slightly different ways. And what I want to know from everybody watching is, if you put any, do you feel like these lists hold any value? And if you do, what makes them valuable to you? Do you find them valuable because there is a panel of experts who have curated these lists, who have presented them to you and have told you, this is what we feel as people who work in this field, either as authors or reviewers or critics, we feel like this is the best selection of fantasy books that we could think of? Or do you prefer to look at lists that have been voted on by popular opinion? So that would include lists like the Reddit Top 100 Fantasy Selections that just came out a couple of weeks ago, and that they update and change on a year-to-year basis. Do you find that it is more valuable to know what your peers think of specific books, which books they rate the highest or they feel like are the best books that they have ever read? Do you find neither of those things valuable? I think it's really interesting to at least put some thought into that and look at and examine why we hold certain things in higher value than others. So the 4 types of lists that I'm going to talk about today, these are the 4 that have been on my radar lately, and they all came into being or into fruition in slightly different ways. So we have, as I said before, the Time Top 100 Fantasy List. This was a completely curated list, and it was put together by the kind of quote-unquote expert panel that had been selected. So this was a collection of fantasy authors, I believe adult and young adult authors, who sat together roundtable style and compiled this list to then be released. And they had some reasons behind their choices, which they outlined when the article came out. Then we have the NPR's Top 50 Fantasy Books of the Last 10 Years. So that is smaller in scope. That is dealing with just books over the past decade. So what these, the people who compiled the list, what they felt was or were the most influential works of fantasy that have changed the genre, that have added the most to the genre over the last 10 years. And this list was put together a little bit differently than the Time Top 100. So this one was a popular vote. So a bunch of people sent in their opinions of the best fantasy novels over the past 10 years. But then they had an expert panel who went in afterward and looked at all of those selections and then picked the 50 that they felt were the most representative of the genre. So there was kind of a twofold process there. You have the popular opinion or the opinion of the masses, and then you also have that expert opinion weighing in. If we move outside that scope, and these are going to be some lists that are a little bit older but have been on my radar recently for various reasons. So the first that I have is a list that was put together by Michael Moorcock and a colleague of his, and that was their top 100 fantasy of all time. So the top 100 fantasy books that they feel were most influential in building up the fantasy genre, the books that they feel like have lent the most to the fantasy genre, that provide the best experience of what fantasy has to offer. And these are much less mainstream books. Obviously, I read a lot of fantasy, not the most fantasy of anybody out there, but I do read a fair bit. And I have to say that when I looked through this list of top 100 books, it is definitely the least number of books that I have ever checked off on a list like this before, which was a really great experience for me because it gave me a lot of fruit for thought. It gave me a lot of good recommendations, good places to look for fantasy books that can help broaden my own personal horizons. But this comes from someone who is a fantasy author and a well-known fantasy critic who likes to deconstruct the fantasy genre. So this is a list that is 100% admittedly subjective, his own personal taste, personal opinion put out there for anybody who would like to follow that through. And then the fourth list that I have, or that I've been thinking about a lot lately, is the Fantasy Masterclass series. So this is a list that is put together by a publisher, and this happens fairly often in publishing, is that you will get publishing houses, either like Penguin has a lot of these lines that they put out, where they will select books that they feel are representative of a particular genre. So Penguin, for example, had their horror classics that they re-released a couple of years ago with beautiful covers, new introductions by different authors, and that was to help people identify or pinpoint mega works in the history of horror publishing that perhaps had been forgotten a little bit to time. And so the relevant fantasy list is a list of fantasy masterworks. I believe there are 50 on this list, but they may have expanded it in later years. This is the Fantasy Master List that was put together by Jo Fletcher, who is a very well-known literary, I believe she's an editor and not an agent, but works in publishing and works with a lot of really big name authors and is obviously a huge advocate for fantasy in general, has a vast working knowledge of the genre, where it has been, where it is now, and where it is going, because of the work that she does in the publishing industry. So I think that that is kind of your expert list that has been compiled. So those are 4 different kinds of lists. And if you look through these, and I'm not going to list them all out in this video because I feel like that would be very tedious, I will link them all below. So if you're interested, you can take a look at these different lists. Actually, there's 5. Not 4. So you can take a look at all of these different lists and see what kinds of books are making the lists, which ones show up time after time, how this changes depending on whether you're looking at the popular vote or you're looking at expert consensus or expert opinion. And I guess it can also help you to see some of the bias that goes into creating these lists, because if we take the Time Top 100 list, for example, there are a number of authors who served on that panel, and for all of them, one of their books ended up on the list. These were very well-known authors who are creating, wonderful works of art, who are writing excellent books. But, as someone who likes to, and part of my job is critical analysis. I need to be able to do this in a research capacity. I need to be able to look at a paper and look at whether or not the results can be translated into evidence that can be applied to how I treat patients. And I'm not saying that I can critically deconstruct a book list in the same way that I can critically deconstruct a research paper. But whenever we look at anything that's out in the world, we need to be aware that there are inherent biases that can come into that mix. We need to be aware of the circumstances, how these lists were put together, what goes into making them. And I just know as a person, were I to serve on a panel with a group of, let's say, 5 people, if 4 of those people all had books on this list and one person was left out, I would not like that would feel bad. You would feel sad and upset for the person whose book did not make the list. So I'm not saying that is what happened in terms of putting this Time Top 100 list together, but I think that we need to recognize that whenever we put human feelings into something, it is inevitably going to change the results. It is what we get. The product we are given is going to reflect how we think and how we feel as people. People are humans. They have human emotions, and we, whether consciously or unconsciously, are directed and ruled by those emotions from time to time. So I think when we look at lists that are put together in that way, that we have to confront those particular forms of bias, I guess. So I think that when I look at those lists, they don't make me upset. Like, I didn't get any particularly angry feelings from looking at that top 100 list, but as I read it, I recognized that it had to reflect the bias of just trying to put a list like that together. We also have to look at where are the publishing giants? Like, where are these big publishing houses located? What types of stories are they seeking? What types of stories make their way to the top of the literary world? Does that always mean that they are the stories that have the most merit, or are they the stories that reflect the experiences of the people who are most likely to read them? I think that we have to acknowledge that source of bias as well when we're putting those lists together. So it's very difficult to get a list that is going to be representative of the very best, but I think that at least I find value in those lists because we are getting a snapshot of some of the books and some of the works that have obviously had a profound effect on people, and I think that is valuable. I like knowing that. I enjoy having that. Like I said, this is part of what I find interesting to do. I have looked at all these lists and compared the books that have made it on, in one form or another. And I like looking at that, which authors tend to be at the top in terms of popular vote versus which ones show up on these more obscure lists, which ones are a little more pretentious and tend to turn up on this list versus that list. And I like knowing all of that, but I enjoy seeing the results no matter how they are put together. So I personally find value in having lists of all kinds. I think right now, because of being on BookTube, if you're here and you're watching, you clearly find value in knowing the opinions of someone whose tastes align with yours, because presumably if you're watching a channel, then you have checked out some of the content on that channel and you find that you can tell based on what a person thinks whether or not a book will work well for you or not, because there are so many books. There are thousands upon thousands of books out there to read, and we can only read a small fraction of that number. So having sources like this to help direct your attention, to help you find books that you might not otherwise cross, I think that there is a lot of value in that. I personally feel that I have moved from wanting to know those popular lists and wanting to find out the names of the books on those lists and read the books on those lists. I think at this point in my time as a reader, I gravitate more toward those lists like the Fantasy Masterclass, lists like Michael Moorcock's Top 100, where there's going to be books that I haven't encountered before, where there are going to be books that I feel like can push me to learn something about fantasy or look at fantasy in a different way or through a different lens. Because the popular books I'm going to find from BookTube. I watch a ton of my friends' videos. I am going to find those books. I am going to see them on the end caps at the bookstore. I am going to find them in other ways. So even though I still like perusing those lists like the Time, Top 100, etc., I don't find that they are as valuable for me at this point where I am as a reader because I'm getting that information elsewhere. But I do really like looking through those other types of lists that might have some of those obscure books and some of those books that I had never heard about before. But I would really like to hear from you. Do you feel like these lists in general are just a sham? That there's no value in them whatsoever because we can't separate them from their bias? Do you feel like you want to know what the most popular books are because that can help you direct your reading? We only have so much room on our TBR, and it would be great if we were always reading books that we were going to love. Would you prefer to find someone whose tastes align with yours and just base your opinions off of what they have read? I would really like to know. Before BookTube, these types of lists were really how I found most of my books. If I wasn't getting something from my dad or from a friend, this was really the place that I had to look. So BookTube has definitely opened my options up a lot and has really helped me curate a TBR that I feel excited about reading. But I do think that there's still value in these types of lists. And kind of to shift gears a little bit to a related topic is the idea of book awards. As I was thinking about these lists and thinking about the books that end up on there, I also found my mind wandering a little bit to literary awards. And it was actually a comment that I read, and I don't know if it was on my video or on a video of one of my friends' channels that I was just reading the comments and happened to see it, but I thought it was a really interesting and thoughtful comment. And someone had essentially said, I know that if a book wins I think it was the Nebula Award. If a book wins the Nebula Award, I'm not going to like it because it seems like they have X, Y, and Z criteria, and those tend to be the types of things that I don't like. So I actually find it pretty helpful to know what has won because I can steer away from that. And it made me just think about literary awards in general and how much attention I pay to them. And I actually have very defined opinions about literary awards, and I use them in a very particular way. So there are innumerable literary awards. There are more than I can name, but in the sci-fi fantasy sphere, we obviously have the Hugo, the Nebula, and we have the World Fantasy Award. There's the Bram Stoker Horror Award that kind of ties into fantasy sometimes. And then those are really, I guess, the Goodreads Choice Awards. Those are usually categorized and they come up at the end of every year. A lot of us use Goodreads, so I'm sure we all get to see those as well. And with the exception of the Goodreads Award, which is a popular vote, most of these awards are decided by expert panel. And just as I said, we are an imperfect species and all the things that we do are influenced by our own sources of bias. The same goes for literary awards. There are trends and tropes and styles that wax and wane in popularity, and those definitely have influences on the types of books, the types of art that wins awards. So that makes total sense. It is more knowing if the types of books that tend to end up on these lists, if that is valuable for you. I will say that I do not find the Sci-Fi Fantasy Awards to be particularly valuable for me. I spend a lot of time keeping up on the big publishing names in science fiction, in the science fiction and fantasy realm. I like to follow a lot of the literary agents or editors who represent the authors that I like, and so presumably will also take on new clients and represent authors who have similar styles or who write similar types of books. So I feel like I am pretty up on what is happening in the sci-fi fantasy publishing world. My sphere of booktube is almost exclusively sci-fi fantasy. All the channels that I watch talk a lot about sci-fi fantasy. So I feel like I have a pretty good working knowledge of what is going on in the sci-fi fantasy world. Even if I haven't read a book, I can probably tell if it's coming out that year, what it's going to be like, what it's about, which titles I can compare it to, and whether or not I want to add it to my TBR. So when the award nominees come out for the World Fantasy Award or the Hugo or the Nebula, I am excited if one of the authors that I really respect and admire ends up on those awards, because I think it must be wonderful to have your work recognized like that. And I am happy that those types of things exist, because it feels nice to have your art that you have poured so much of yourself into recognized on a global scale. So I like the idea of those awards. I think that it's nice to get that recognition at that level. But they're not incredibly helpful for me, because I kind of know what I want to read. I have a good idea of which authors I'm looking out for, what is going to kind of tick my areas of interest. But by contrast, because there's not enough time to keep up on everything, you cannot possibly be up to date on every genre, every author, every publisher, every book that's coming out. It's just not possible. And this is when I was reading more romance and young adult fiction and literary fiction, I knew less about sci-fi fantasy. Now that I'm reading a lot of sci-fi fantasy, I know less about what's happening in the literary or young adult or middle grade or romance worlds. And so this is where I find literary awards to be particularly helpful. For the genres that I don't have the time to invest in knowing what is making waves, what is pushing boundaries, what is kind of turning everyone's head or making everyone talk, I don't know what those books are. And I also don't have the time or the knowledge or the skill set to curate lists of books that I think will appeal to my personal tastes. Whereas in sci-fi fantasy, I can look for those hidden gems. I can look for those under-recognized books. I can search and I can know if I found something that is really riding under everybody's radar. But for other genres, I would literally have to go to a bookstore and pick a random book off the shelf and just hope that it was something that I liked, because I don't have the time to do that. I don't have the time to curate that kind of list for myself. So I find awards like the Man Booker Prize, which is for the countries of the Commonwealth, I believe, the Scotiabank Giller Prize, which is one of the highest literary awards for Canadian fiction, the Pulitzer Prize, the Newbery Medal Award for middle grade fiction, the William Morris Award for young adult fiction. Those types of literary awards I find valuable for me, because I don't have enough time to keep up on everything. I wish I did. I wish that there were, clones of me and we could all upload the information that we gained into my particular brain and that I could know all these things and be up on it, but I can't. It's just not possible. So I actually find those lists very helpful. I have had a lot of luck, especially with the Pulitzer Prize winners. The books that I have read, I have found it very rewarding to be able to read them, to be able to see what styles and what types of books reflect what is happening in the literary world. I find the Newbery Medal Award winners, the middle grade award winners, always to be excellent selections. I've never really been pushed astray by that panel. So I find that looking at the nominees and the winners for those types of awards has been really helpful for me, because it then helps me focus in on a couple of books from those different genres that maybe I wouldn't have known where to start or wouldn't have known what to read. So I think for me personally, I find the literary awards to be more valuable in terms of the genres that I'm not as familiar with, as opposed to the genres that I am familiar with. And I don't know what everybody else thinks of that. I would love to know, do you keep track of the award winners? Do you try to read the short lists or the long lists for any of these particular awards? Do you find awards like the Goodreads Choice Awards, where people get to vote in? Do you feel like that is a more accurate reflection of what is going to work for you personally? Or do you like having these expert opinions weigh in? I would love to know. I would love to know what you like and don't like about these curated lists and about literary awards in general. I think there's a lot of awesome content on BookTube. I love making book reviews. I love making ranking videos, all those kinds of things. But I also love just the engagement and the ability to chat with other people who love books. So I would like to know your opinions on these things, where you stand, and I think that it could be really interesting to see everybody's answers. So I hope that this has not been too random a video and that you enjoyed watching it, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!